Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's hearing. Today we're going to resume taking evidence, and we're going to pick up where we left off just before Christmas by hearing further evidence from the National House Building Council. Mr. Millett.
Yes, good morning, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, members of the panel. I now call Mr. John Lewis, please.
Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Lewis. I understand you're going to take the oath. So would you take the testament there in your right hand, please, and read the words on the screen in front of you.
I swear by Almighty God that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Thank you very much. Now sit down and make yourself comfortable. Right. Yes, Mr. Millett, when you're ready.
Thank you. Mr. Lewis, good morning.
Good morning.
Can I start by thanking you very much for coming to the inquiry and assisting us with your evidence? We're extremely grateful to you. If you have any difficulty understanding any of the questions I'm going to ask you, I can rephrase the question or repeat it as you like. If you want to break at any time other than the scheduled breaks that we're going to take at the normal time, please just ask and we can take a break. Can I ask you also, please, to keep your voice up so that the person who sits to your right can get down exactly what you say clearly, so we have a nice clean transcript. Don't shake your head or nod your head. You have to say yes or no, as the case may be. Can I also ask you, please, to listen carefully to my questions as well and answer the questions that I'm putting to you. Now, you've provided two witness statements to the inquiry. One was in response to a request for documentary disclosure, and one in response to a request for evidence. Can I show them to you, please? The first is NHB 401332 and is dated the 28th of January 2020. There it is on the screen. Is that your first statement?
It is, yes.
And can we go to page 3? There's a signature there. Is that your signature above the date?
It hasn't come through yet.
It hasn't. It's page 3. There it is.
Yes, that's my signature.
Thank you. And the second witness statement is at NHB 403433 and is dated the 5th of October 2021. Is that the first page of your 5th October statement?
It is, yes.
Thank you. And if we go to page 69, please, you'll see that there's a signature above the date there. Is that your signature?
It is, yes.
Have you read these witness statements, and particularly this 69-page second witness statement recently?
Yes, I have.
And can you or do you say that the contents of it are true?
Yes, to the best of my knowledge, they are true.
And have you discussed your statement or your evidence that you're going to give today with anybody before coming here?
Only with my legal team.
Right. Can I ask you just to keep your voice up if you can, please, so
Sure.
we can hear you clearly? Now, I'm going to start with a few questions about your background, your qualifications and experience before coming on to your work at the NHBC. And throughout my questions, I'm going to be referring to your second witness statement, NHB 403433, specifically. Now, to summarise, in your witness statement, page 3 at paragraph 7A to D, you set out your qualifications. Can we just tick them off? First, you have a Bachelor of Science in Construction Management.
Yes, that's correct.
And a Master of Science in Fire and Explosion Engineering, yes?
Yes, that's correct.
And a Diploma in Fire Safety Engineering, I think at the time of writing your second statement, that you had, yes?
No, the diploma was completed in about 1998, I believe.
Yes. And at the time of your statement, you were in the process, I think, of applying to be a chartered engineer through the IFE.
Yes, that application is still ongoing.
It's still ongoing. Now, before working at the NHBC, I think you'd worked in the building control industry, hadn't you?
I worked for local authority building control before joining NHBC. I was also involved in building control at NHBC, but as an approved inspector.
Yes. And just before the NHBC, I think you had 3 years, 1994 to 1997, for the LABC at Rydale District Council.
That's correct, yes.
How long did you work for the LABC?
Just for those 3 years.
Just those 3 years. And what position did you hold?
I started off in 1994 as a trainee building control officer, and some months later became an assistant building control officer.
Right. And at the time you left in 1997 to go to the NHBC, what role at the LABC did you hold?
I was an assistant building control officer.
Paraphrasing paragraph 8 of your statement, as we can see on the screen, if we can just have that in full. You, I think, worked for the NHBC from 1997 until just recently. Is that right?
That's correct, yes.
And from 2013, I think you were a specialist building control surveyor, which you say meant that you were NHBC's specialist fire engineer.
Yes, the role was titled a specialist building surveyor.
Yes.
It was intended that I did other than fire things at the time, but I tended to only do fire engineering issues.
Right. And you say in 8C there, as you can see, that the role of specialist building control surveyor meant I was NHBC specialist fire engineer, as detailed below. So was the role as a specialist fire engineer, or did it just involve drawing on your recently acquired expertise in fire engineering?
It was, as I say, it was a role that was intended that I did other than fire stuff. But I had just completed my master's degree, and so yes, it was intended that I would be the specialist within NHBC dealing with, the fire engineering and fire specialist inquiries.
Were you the only specialist fire engineer at NHBC at and from that time?
I was until about 2016 when another fire engineer joined NHBC.
Was that Mr. Catcoria?
It was, yes.
Now, did that mean that during that period, 2013 to 2016, you were the only one? You were the only fire engineer there?
Yes.
Does that mean that your work in that specialist field was never peer-reviewed internally by somebody with equivalent qualifications?
No, it wasn't.
As at October 2021, you held that role, I think, but from 2018 within the major projects team. Is that right?
That's correct.
And major projects, is this right, are 8 stories or above, in other words, high-rises?
Yes, I believe that was the criteria.
Why was that team created in 2018?
It was felt at the time that the majority of tall, more complex buildings were being constructed within London, and the NHBC took the view that they should bring together a specialist team, not just of surveyors and engineers and specialists in those taller buildings, bring them together into a team within a London office with a London base so that they were accessible to our customers.
Did the fact of the Grenfell Tower fire in June 2017 play any part in the decision to create that team in 2018?
No, the major projects team was set up in 2016. I think actually even earlier, maybe the summer of 2015.
Right.
I didn't join it until 2018.
I follow. Now, you told us you left in late 2021. Where do you work now?
I now work for Taylor Wimpey.
Taylor Wimpey. And what's your current position?
I'm a senior fire engineer with them.
During the years from 1997 until 2013, you say you worked in a number of different roles at NHBC as a building control surveyor. That's right, is it?
That's correct, apart from a brief time out working for another company.
Right. And did your roles involve residential buildings above 18 metres?
Only towards the end of that period of time. At the start, I was mainly doing much more low-rise things. I worked also with the commercial building control team, which was largely non-residential schemes for a few years, and it was only towards the end of that time that I got more involved in high-rise residential.
And during your time at the NHBC, I think you were not part of management or the NHBC board?
No.
I'd like to turn then to the functions and divisions of the NHBC and take that quite quickly. You say at paragraph 14 in your statement on page 4, if we can just have that up, that a large part of the NHBC's business was to provide warranty cover for new build properties across the country. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And the purpose was to increase standards in the or improve standards in the construction industry. Yes.
As well as providing the warranty cover, yes, that was another, intention of the NHBC's role.
Now, we know from the evidence of Mr. Evans that NHBC had a subsidiary, NHBC BCS, Building Control Services Limited, which carried out building control work through the approved inspector regime, which is basically private sector building control. Yes?
Yes, that's correct.
Yes. And do you agree that the NHBC provided warranties for over 80% of the new build market?
I'm not sure of the figure, but it sounds a likely figure.
Right. At all events, the NHBC, I think you would agree, is the largest private sector building control body in the UK.
Yes, I believe that's correct.
And in your statement at paragraph 22, we don't need to turn it up, you estimate that in the period 2005 to 2019, NHBC BCS had over 60% of the market share of the residential market. That's, I think, what you say.
Yes, it was around that figure.
How did you arrive at 60% or over 60% during that 14-year period?
I just recall it from, we were informed at various corporate meetings that we held somewhere around about the 60% of the residential market share. I believe it did fluctuate year on year. Some years it was below that and some years it was more. I didn't particularly keep abreast of those figures particularly.
Do you happen to know what the residential market share for building control services was during the period 2013 to 2016?
No.
During any of your time, 2005 to 2019, did the market share ever fall below 50%?
I don't know.
You don't know. Now, just to be clear, you say that Steve Evans was the building control manager for the technical services department, reporting to Diane Marshall, and in her turn, Diane Marshall was head of that department, reporting up to Ian Davis, and Ian Davis was the operational director until the end of 2017. I'm summarising paragraph 18 on page 5. Can you confirm that?
Yes, that's correct.
And did Ian Davis report to the main board of NHBC?
I believe so. He was a director, so I would think so, yes.
How closely did you work with Steve Evans?
Steve Evans was my direct line manager from 2013 to 2018.
Who else within NHBC had specialist knowledge of fire engineering between the dates 2013, say August 2013, and June 2017?
Only my ex-colleague Malik Kapkoria, who joined, I think was December 2015.
Right. Now, going back to your statement at page 6, please, if we can go to that, paragraph 20, at the top of that page, you say this, in the second line, the projects that I understand the inquiry is focused on, which were 8 stories or higher, were covered by NHBC's major projects team. This had 2 sections, special risk project managers who looked after warranty aspects, and a separate section of specialist surveyors looking at building control. Now, Steve Evans made reference in his evidence to buildings over 6 stories in height being considered by the NHBC to be those over 18 metres. That was his evidence. Why do you say 8 stories here?
Because I believe the major projects team dealt with buildings over 8 stories. The 6 stories, I believe that the bit between 6 stories and 8 stories did still rest with the technical services department rather than the major projects team. I think, they didn't fall into that 8-story
right
and higher category.
I mean, do you know from your own knowledge as a specialist fire engineer that 6 stories is generally accepted as the numerical equivalent of 18 metres?
Yes, I'm aware of that.
So can you account for the difference between 6 stories and 8 stories so far as the interests of the major projects team was concerned?
I can't. I was not involved in setting up the major projects team. That was carried out, I believe, mostly by Ian Davis, and that was 8 stories and above was where it was set.
Right.
You know.
You don't know how 8 stories was arrived at as a number?
No, I don't.
Now, to be clear, were the special risk project managers involved only in warranty projects, or do they also have a role in building control?
There was a wide overlap. They were there to most of the building control, well, in fact, all of the building control projects, I would say, also had the warranty side. And so if it was with NHBC for building control, it would also be being dealt with for warranty.
Right, as the norm?
That was the norm, yes.
Right. Other than you, did anybody else in the major projects team have any qualifications in fire engineering?
Not that I'm aware of. I know there were several of my colleagues who I believed were members of the Institution of Fire Engineers, but beyond that, I don't think any of them held any particularly formal qualifications in fire engineering.
And who were those colleagues?
From memory, there was a lady, Hassi, I can't remember her surname, Hassanatu. I know she was a member of the Institution of Fire Engineers, or became one during her period at NHBC. I would be guessing to suggest anybody else.
Right. Now, let's turn then to a different topic, which is the building regulations. And you've very helpfully set out in your statement to us your knowledge of the building regulations and the related approved guidance and how they in turn relate to buildings above 18 metres in height. Can we look, please, at page 7 of your witness statement, at the bottom of the page, paragraph 26. And in relation to large-scale fire testing, you say there, at the beginning, the BS8414 test series related to the rate of fire spread across and within walls. In the period of 2000 to 2013, I did not have much awareness of the BS8414 test series, although I knew it was a test for external fire spread. Prior to 2013, I mostly dealt with residential and non-residential buildings which were lower than 18 metres, to which paragraph 12.7 of ADB did not apply. Now, you may not have been a qualified fire engineer until, is it right, August 2013?
Yes, correct.
But I think you did have, at least have awareness of such a thing as large-scale fire testing before August 2013. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
Right, and you knew at the very least that that was a test for external fire spread?
Yes, I did.
Yes, which was relevant, did you know, to the achievement of functional requirement B4, B41 of the building regulations?
Yes, I knew it was cited in approved document B as a way that external facades could be assessed.
Yes. Now, I'd like just to show you something, which is a report commissioned by NHBC, for which you were, I think, part of the stakeholder group. NHB 50452, please. And it's a document entitled, if you can see on the screen, Fire Performance of Highly Insulated Residential Buildings and Modern Methods of Construction, a literature review, and the date is the 14th of April 2010, prepared for NHBC Foundation. Just on that, are you familiar with this document? Do you remember it?
Yes, I do.
Can we go to page 2? You can see that it was prepared by the BRE, Tom Lennon and Danny Hopkin, approved by Steve Manchester. Do you know what led to its being commissioned?
I recall that the issue originally, the aim of the document was to understand how the more modern buildings at that time, which were that were highly insulated, whether that would make for a much more severe fire, should a fire occur within them. That was my understanding of that document.
Yes, but was there a prompt, a trigger, which led to this document being commissioned that you can tell us about?
No, not that I recall. The first I knew was when I was asked if I would like to sit on the stakeholder group.
Can we go to page 6 of the document, and you can see that the title there is Engagement of Project Stakeholder Group, and then there's a list of names, affiliations, and who they represent. And you can see that just above halfway through that list, which includes people like Sarah Colwell, Brian Martin, Graham Perrier, and Debbie Smith, your name appears. Do you see that?
Yes, I can see that.
Representing approved inspectors. Did you read this report when it came out?
Yes, I did do, yes.
And presumably you read it when you were a part of the stakeholder group?
Yes, it would have been shortly after it was published.
Right. Now, I don't want to go through this report in detail, but unless we have to, but do you remember that this report looked at both internal and external fire spread?
I don't recall.
You don't recall. And it looked at small-scale testing, large-scale testing, and the fact that modern buildings were using more and more combustible materials. I can show you a part of the report if you like. Let's go to page 27, please, and let's look there at paragraph 3.4.2. You can see external fire spread there at the foot of the screen. There are 3 main potential ignition sources in relation to external fire spread. They are, and then you can see radiated heat, external fire source in direct contact with the building, and fire breaking out of one of the compartments. And then there's a long paragraph after that, which identifies controls due to restrictions on the amount of combustible material. And there's a reference in the middle of the paragraph to the testing, ignitability, flame spread, heat release. Then it says, many of the cladding systems now on the market are complex composite or built-up systems where an assessment of the characteristics of the exposed surface with respect to flame spread may not provide an accurate picture of performance in a realistic fire scenario. For this reason, and due to some high-profile fires involving vertical flame spread, particularly the fire at Irvine in 1999, House of Commons 1999, a new, large-scale test method was developed by BRE and eventually became the basis of a British standard BSI 2002 fire test for cladding systems. The test method looks at performance due to a realistic fire scenario corresponding to a fully developed fire within a compartment with external flaming from a window opening impinging directly on the external facade. The test considers system performance rather than surface spread of flame properties in isolation. I've read quite a bit of that to you. Is it fair to say that in and from the date of this report at least, you were well aware of the common use of combustible materials over 18 metres?
Yes, we knew that combustible insulation was becoming a much more common insulation material used on tall buildings, yes.
Now let's go back to your statement at page 7 and pick it up in the same place where we were, paragraph 26. And you say, continuing with the paragraph, on the few residential schemes of mine which exceeded this height, it was policy that our special risk project manager teams, being specialists in the whole arena of facade types and construction, would assess and advise of fire safety requirements for this component of the building, alongside any requirements for water ingress, air infiltration, pressure equalization barriers, etc. In addition, the fire engineers for these buildings did not include any reference to paragraph 12.7, and with K-15 generally being the most common board-type insulation, a cursory read of their BBA certificate and marketing literature gave the impression that their product had been tested to BS 8414 and so was suitable for use. However, my knowledge in this area expanded, especially in the period of 2013 to 2014. Now, is the process that you're describing in the passage I've just read to you what happened between 2000 and 2013 at the NHBC? Are you describing events there in summary between those 2 years?
Sorry, could you just go back up a page?
Yes. Can we go back to page 7, at the foot of the page? You start that passage I've read to you with the words prior to 2013. And my question is everything that you're describing there that I've read to you something that happened between 2000 and 2013?
I can't recall when the special risk project manager teams were set up. That could have been after the year 2000.
Right. But can we take it that in general, what you're describing here is what pertained at the NHBC between 2000 and 2013?
In general, yes.
Yes.
Sorry, could you clarify the question, please?
Yes. I read a large chunk of text to you which starts with the words prior to 2013. And really just all I'm seeking to get from you is confirmation that everything you described there was the status quo, was the situation, if you like, at the NHBC before 2013, starting in 2000.
Possibly, as I say, I can't remember when the SRPM teams were set up. Certainly they were around from around 2006 onwards.
Right.
I can't, I'm hazy on what happened prior to that, from 2000 to that time.
Yes, I understand. Now, 4 lines up from the bottom of that page, on the right-hand side, you can see it, you say, in addition, the fire engineers for these buildings. Who were they?
I mean the consultant fire engineers that were engaged by the developers of the buildings.
Oh, I see, not NHBC people.
No.
Right. And do you have any idea why those individuals would not make reference to 12.7 of approved document B? Or perhaps 13.7, as it became during that period?
I don't. I think there was, on most of the jobs that we saw, the consultant fire engineers dealing with Regulation B4 generally just considered the boundary distances, the radiated heat spread to other buildings. There was not very often that any of them made any reference to paragraph 12.7.
Right. So is this right, that until 2013 the use of K-15 was widespread and accepted by fire engineers, in other words, the developers' fire engineers, on the basis of a cursory read of the BBA certificate and Kingspan's marketing literature?
Generally, what we saw was that the fire engineers would write a fire strategy, in that they would say the building will comply with approved document B,
Right.
and that was as far as it went. The change, that was always written at the very start of a construction project, before details of materials were generally known or had been agreed by the construction teams. It was usually much later on that the way the facades were built, that information was provided.
So far as the NHBC was concerned, is it correct that until 2013 the use of K-15 was accepted by the NHBC on the basis of a cursory read of the BBA certificate and Kingspan's marketing literature?
I can't speak for what my colleagues did.
No.
I know that when I was asked, and it was not on very many occasions at this time, if I was asked or shown the Kingspan K-15 BBA certificate, then the reading of that was that, and the information we got from Kingspan was generally that it was suitable for use on buildings over 18 metres.
So you took what documents you were given at face value?
The BBA certificate, as I think Steve alluded to, did suggest at the time that further information would be or should be obtained from Kingspan.
Well, we'll come to the BBA certificate, but in general, Was it your practice and, to your knowledge, the practice of your colleagues within the NHBC that they would take the certificate and the marketing literature from Kingspan at face value?
There was very much a reliance on Kingspan to advise how to use that product on those buildings. So, you know, either rightly or wrongly, I think, yes, we did rely upon Kingspan to advise how their product should be used on tall buildings.
Up until 2013, what was NHBC's approach to the use of other combustible elements of an external build-up on buildings over 18 metres, such as ACM panels?
Again, we knew that, anecdotally at least, that it was used in some situations. What we did also find was that often the selection of the panel, either we weren't informed of it, or it was a change which had happened, you know, when the builders, value engineers or procurement people had got involved. I'm not aware that, you know, I'm not aware of any time that it came across my desk to use 100% PE code ACM material, and you know, it was asked, is this suitable? And if it had been, then, you know, we would be saying, no, it's not.
Can I ask you to look, please, at Diane Marshall's statement, which is at NHB 403434. And let's go to page 17. I'll show you the first page, page 1, just to identify the document. NHB 403434. There's her statement to the inquiry, 6th of October 2021. And if we go, please, to page 17, paragraph 72, she says this. Prior to 2015, NHBC's approach towards K-15, which was allowed by approved document B, was to rely on the BBA certificate for K-15 that was first issued on 27th of October 2008. This BBA certificate stated that K-15 was acceptable for buildings over 18 metres tall, provided that the manufacturer's approval for the arrangement was obtained. Do you agree with what she has written there?
Yes, that was the understanding of the BBA certificate, yes.
And was that your own understanding?
It was at the time, yes.
As a fire engineer, as you were qualified to be from, I think, August 2013, are you able to explain how that approach complied with any of the routes to compliance within approved document B?
Well, the approved document B, the first option was, it didn't comply with the first option, which was the limited combustibility. The second one suggested reference to testing. The BBA certificate was understood under Regulation 7 to be a suitable method of demonstrating compliance. And that certificate said seek advice from the manufacturer. So
just help me, what route to compliance in ADB is satisfied by seeking the manufacturer's approval, Mr. Lewis?
it was well, it didn't fit directly with that. It was, you know, as we came onto when we were writing the BCA guidance note, it was really, you know, the testing that had been done, that then being extrapolated by people that could extrapolate it to say that it was, you know, likely to support a construction which it was proposed.
Can I take it that from August 2013 you were familiar with the routes to compliance in the approved documents?
Yes, I was.
So do you agree that either the material used over 18 metres in an external wall, being insulation, had to be a material of limited combustibility? That was the first option, yes?
Yes.
Yes. There was an alternative, wasn't there, which was that if such a material was to be used, or insulation material was to be used in an external wall build-up, it had to be tested under BS 8414, either Part 1 or Part 2, and satisfy the criteria set out in BR 135, yes?
Yes, that's correct.
Yes. And from June 2014, as we'll come to, option 3 desktops, but we'll come back to that. Yes?
Yes.
Yes. So taking all of that into account, can you explain to us how K-15, a combustible material, could be approved for use over 18 metres merely by reliance on a BBA certificate that simply told you to seek the manufacturer's approval?
Because sitting alongside the approved document B was the Regulation 7 approved document, which also then cited that, BBA certificates could be considered as suitable, also as suitable evidence for meeting the building regulations.
When did the approach that Diane Marshall has set out in her statement at paragraph 72 there begin? She says it prior to 2015. Can you give us a starting date?
I can't, no, I think that's a question for Diane.
Right. And this was the approach, to your understanding, was it, by the NHBC to buildings above 18 metres using K-15 until 2015, yes?
Well, I can't say that it was a, written down policy, as such. The use of BBA certificates was considered to be a way of meeting the building regulations, a way that the approved inspector was carrying out their function.
Right. Now, we'll come back to the BBA certificate for K-15 later in your evidence. I want just to ask you now about when you first had concerns about the use of combustible materials in tall buildings, as we know you did. Can we start by looking at your statement, please? Paragraph 47 on page 12. I think I can summarise what you say there. And at paragraph 47, you say, I recall I first became aware of a possible issue with the use of and compliance of combustible materials being used in buildings over 18 metres around the time it was raised by Steve Cook to Steve Evans in August 2013 in relation to queries he had from his builder customers about K-15 on buildings over 18 metres. Shortly after that, I recall, an NHBC surveyor, Chris Cooley, also raised it. However, for me, the issue really came to the forefront in November 2013 when Wintech raised it, as I referenced below at paragraph 50 onwards. Now, August 2013, you refer to there, was it the same month that you became a specialist building control surveyor within the NHBC?
It is, yes.
Yes. And was that the date you achieved your specialist fire engineering qualification?
It was around that time, I
Right.
think, maybe the month before.
Right. And the change in position to specialist building control surveyor, I think, was as a result of now being NHBC specialist fire engineer. I think you've told us that before, but just confirm that.
Yes.
Yes. So was it a coincidence that in the same month that this issue was raised by Steve Cook to Steve Evans, you become NHBC's fire engineer?
No, it wasn't a coincidence.
If it wasn't a coincidence, can you explain how the two came together?
Sorry. I did the master's degree. It was me requesting NHBC. That just so happened to finish in around July 2013. And then I, having then got that specialist knowledge, I moved over to become the specialist, in fire engineering at the NHBC in August, yes.
Yeah. Did you alert Steve Cook to the problem?
No, I didn't.
It wasn't you?
No.
Right. Before you took on that new role, what had NHBC done, do you know, in relation to gaining fire specialist advice on large and complex buildings?
Prior to me taking over the role, NHBC would go to an external consultant
Right.
with these queries.
I see. So before August 2013, with you there as the newly qualified fire engineer, does that tell us that before that date, NHBC had no internal expertise of that kind at all?
Well, I was consulted on a number of fire issues. It wasn't my role to be the specialist, but obviously NHBC knew I was doing the master's degree, and they would run things past me and ask my opinion on a number of things. I'm looking at that one there. I recall the Chris Cooley. I recall that Chris raised an issue with K-15, and my response was, we shouldn't accept it.
You refer to an external consultant. Who was the external consultant who would be consulted by the NHBC?
At that time, it was Jim Galt. He was ex-head of fire engineering at the London Fire Brigade.
We didn't catch his name. Could you just repeat it, please?
Yeah, Jim Galt.
Is that G-A-L-T?
G-O-L-T.
G-O-L-T, Jim Galt. Ex-LFB.
He was ex-head of fire engineering at London Fire Brigade.
Providing his services to NHBC as a consultant?
Yes, he had retired from London Fire Brigade and he was working as a consultant.
Right. And how long did he provide these consultancy services to the NHBC for before August 2013?
I'm not sure of how long he was acting prior to that time. I know that he was certainly in place from 2013 till around about 2014.
Right. And before 2013, before August 2013, how frequently did Mr. Galt, how frequently was he asked to give his advice?
I can't put a figure because I wasn't involved in the process of escalating referrals to him.
Right. Do you know how he came to be chosen to act as the external fire specialist consultant to the NHBC?
No, I don't.
Do you know who made the decision to appoint him or at least resort to him?
I don't, no. Prior to Mr. Galt being engaged, NHBC did have its own fire engineer, fire specialist, a chap called Mike Tucker. I understand he was with the NHBC, I think, till around about 2007, maybe 2008. So I would guess that Jim Galt probably took over when Mike Tucker left.
Right. From your knowledge, is this something that Diane Marshall might be able to help us with?
Very likely, yes. I was not involved in this side of things at the time.
Now, you say, I think, that your knowledge in the area of combustible materials and their use above 18 metres expanded after 2013. Was that because you didn't have any dealings with buildings over 18 metres before then, or was it because of your recently acquired qualification?
No, it was mainly, after, as I said in my witness statement, when we had the meeting with Wintech, that was the point at which, I got more involved and more knowledgeable on the matter.
Right. Was becoming a fire engineer something that you had pursued at the behest of NHBC, or was it something that you had done yourself personally?
No, it's something I wanted to do personally.
Right. Who funded it?
NHBC.
Right. And do you know whether that was as a result of NHBC deciding that they needed a specialist fire engineer, or just because they thought it was a good thing to have you do?
It was me that every year you would have a performance development review. One of the questions in that would be, is there any further training? Where would you like your career to go? And it was at one of those where, I'd been thinking that I would like to specialise more in fire engineering, and I suggested to my manager at the time, would NHBC support me in becoming a fire specialist, and that would have been of some use to NHBC.
Right. And did Mr. Galt's services cease after you achieved your qualification in August 2013, or did you work alongside him?
No, he continued up until he retired.
Right. And when was that?
2015, 2016.
Now we're going
once he did retire, NHBC did appoint a further set of consultants to continue. There were areas that was outside of my knowledge, and on those occasions we would still go to external fire engineers for our advice.
And who were they?
We, at the time, I believe we engaged Tenos, Design Fire Consultants, and IFC.
Or International Fire Consultants?
I think that's what it stands for, yes.
Yeah.
John Pagan.
Yes, I see. And why were they engaged? What specialist fields that they had but you didn't have meant that they needed to be consulted?
There would be a number of issues. Generally, it was the computational fluid dynamics, the CFD modelling of smoke movement in residential corridors was an area that I wasn't very competent with. So certainly anything that came in with CFD modelling would go pretty much generally straight outside to one of the other consultants. There would be other things as well that were, quite complex outside of my expertise, finite element analysis, things like that, Steve Evans, my manager, was very clear to me that if I wasn't sure, don't worry about it, we would go to an external consultant, and
Right.
that was how the company operated.
Right. And to the best of your recollection, did NHBC ever go to any external consultants on the question of, and I put this broadly, the safety of the use of K-15 above 18 metres, or the safety of the use of ACM as the external wall panel above 18 metres?
I can't recall any. It's possible that there were. I do recall at least one job where Jim Galt was asked for his view on a cavity barrier type of installation. I can't remember the scheme name.
Now, I'd like to ask you about Kingspan, and we'll do this in, I think, a number of parts. So let's start with part one of Kingspan, if I may. Can we go to your statement and look, please, at the bottom of page 12, para 47, where we've just looked at, and just picking that up, as I've read to you already, just halfway through, you say, shortly after that I recall. You see that? And then you go on to explain the meeting. You refer to an email earlier on, I think, from Chris Cooley to Steve Evans. Let's go to that. NHB 50583. And if we go to the email at the foot of the chain, if we go to the very foot of the chain, you can see that he says, this is Steve Cook to Steve Evans, 28th of August 2013. Subject, Kingspan K-12 and K-15, importance high. Steve, this issue of using a non-combustible cavity insulation for all floors, where there is a floor over 18 metres, and the use of cementitious backing boards or not, is causing a lot of concern to customers, compounded by NHBC's apparent change in stance now that we're picking up on it. Do we have any guidance? If so, can it be released to all? If not, can he provide some? Can we get Kingspan to test their K-12/15 insulants to be non-combustible, create a niche for themselves in the market, and solve the issue once and for all? Now, this is an email of 28th of August 2013, as we can see. To your recollection, did Steve Cook believe K-15 to be non-combustible at that time?
I think Steve didn't think it was non-combustible. I think reading this, he obviously thought that there was a way to test something and it could become non-combustible. It's not a right way of thinking, but that's what I understand from this email, is that he felt that it could be tested, so it could be non-combustible.
How did that work?
It wouldn't work.
No. What were your own views at that time? And I should just say, you did see this email, as I'm going to show you in a moment, but what were your own views about the combustibility or otherwise of K-15?
That if you needed to know the combustibility of a product, you went to their data sheet, and as far as I'm aware, the data sheet was quite clear that it was a Class C.
Right. At this point, did you know that K-15 was a phenolic foam?
Yes.
And did you therefore know, late August, so just post-qualifications, that as a phenolic foam it could not be a material of limited combustibility?
Yes, I believe I was aware of that, yes.
Would you have expected that your colleagues at NHBC would also know that phenolic foam was not and could not be a material of limited combustibility?
I would have expected that they could have found the answer relatively easily, even if they didn't know.
Right. Now, you can see, as I've shown you, that the email starts, this issue of using a combustible cavity insulation for all floors, where there's a floor over 18 metres. Do you know what this issue was? How the issue had come into NHBC and was now being considered?
No, I don't recall. I wasn't really involved in it at this time, and I don't know.
Right.
I just, at the time I knew that this K-15 was being, kicked around, for want of a better word, but I wasn't really involved in it.
Right. Looking at the second line of the first paragraph of this email, Mr. Cook says, brackets, compounded by NHBC's apparent change in stance, now that we are picking up on it, close bracket. What was the change in stance, can you tell us, that is referred to there?
I don't know.
Were you aware of any cases where this had been picked up on, where he says, now that we are picking up on it? Were you aware of any cases where this had been picked up on?
The only one that I recall coming across my desk would have been about this time. It was a query from Chris Cooley about the use of the material.
Right.
It was just a single job. I can't remember which the job was.
Right. Now, if we go to the top of the chain, we can see Steve Evans' response 2 days later, 30th of August 2013, to Steve Cook, and you're copied in on it. And he says, Steve, firstly, not for us to get Kingspan to do any testing. As far as I'm aware, they're aware of the issue, and it's for them to decide what their strategy is. As for guidance, we don't have any, but happy to ask John to look at it, and if required, we can draft something. John, can we chat about this next week? Can you explain what issue it was that Kingspan were aware of, according to Mr. Evans in his email there?
I would be guessing, but it must have been to do with the use of the material being combustible and used over 18 metres, and that it did not fit with the approved document B routes. Is the best I can guess.
Had this issue been, to your knowledge, discussed internally within NHBC before this?
As I say, I was aware of conversations about it, or about the subject, or about the name K-15. I really was, I was not involved in that, and I really was not sure of what was happening at the time.
Very well. And do you know whether there were any discussions with Kingspan at this time on this quotes issue, unquotes?
Again, all I'm aware of is that maybe they were invited into the London team to give a presentation on the use of their material. I wasn't at that presentation, and I'm not even sure if it ever took place, but I thought it had taken place, and I thought that they had been in and talked to the NHBC about the use of that material.
Now, Steve Evans says here that the NHBC didn't have any guidance on the use of combustible insulation. Was the position, as we've seen it, as explained by Diane Marshall in that part of her witness statement I've shown you, that K-15 was being waved through by virtue of having the BBA certificate?
Formally or informally, I think at the time there was probably a reliance or an over-reliance upon Kingspan to give the correct advice, and when Kingspan were approached for that advice, they would tend to say, yes, look, here's a BBA certificate that says it's fine, here's a fire test we've done, and here's an LABC certificate that says it's fine. That would be what would come back. And I think most people at that point said, yeah, it must be okay.
It must be okay. But it must be okay. Is that a robust and appropriate approach for the NHBC to take?
I was not the one that would make those decisions.
Now, Steve Evans says here, as we can see, that, John, can we chat about this next week? Did you have a chat about it the following week? Do you remember?
Possibly, but there's nothing springing to mind.
Do you remember, at least in outline, whether you and he reached some kind of consensus about whether guidance was required?
I can't recall anything.
Do you know, and again, just by way of recollection, how the situation was left as at the end of August 2013? I
don't recall.
Let's move then to October 2013, when the problem was brought to your attention again. NHB 50587, please. And I'd like to start this email chain in the middle, which is the second email down on page 1. And you can see that it starts at the foot of page 1. It's from Dave Cummins of NHBC to you, copied to Steve Cook and Steve Evans. And he says on the top of page 2, hi, John, I attended... Can you see at the top of your screen? Hi, John, I attended a presentation by BRE today at London Fire HQ and got drawn into a conversation at the interval by an AI who obviously has had dealings with ourselves over the issue of insulation materials on high-rise, i.e. over 18 metres. He's copied me an email below that I believe came from John Bean that is basically going against what my thoughts are on the use of limited combustibility. I don't believe K-15 meets this, and wondered if this is something that's being considered by yourself as maybe a policy for Tech Zone. Could I have your thoughts on this, please? And if we look at the email below it that he's sending on, it comes from Andrew Maple on the 16th of October. And he's from Approved Inspector Services, as we can see from the foot of the email we'll come to on page 3. And he provides an extract from what he's been told from someone at NHBC. And he says this, Dave, good to meet you this morning. Below is an extract of email to designers for a couple of high-rise blocks we're dealing with in Stratford. Colleague at NHBC was John Bean, and then there's a quotation you can see in italics. We're happy to provide agreement in principle to use of Kingspan K-15 so far as Part B is concerned. We require 1, fire strategy to document proposal. 2, section drawing showing cladding and insulation and lining makeup. 3, drawing showing cavity barrier / fire break provision to openings and junctions between compartment walls and floors with external walls. 4, treatment of penetrations through the dry lining. 5, clarification of how plaster dabs achieve an R value within the U value calculation. 6, over the page, how proposal is supported by NHBC, who, according to BBA certificate 4K15, still seek drained cavity construction. 7, actual condensation risk analysis for makeups proposed. Now, when you saw that, did you understand from Dave Cummins, your colleague, that he believed that K-15 was not a material of limited combustibility and could not be used over 18 metres, but was drawing to your attention the fact that a colleague seemed to have a different view and was accepting K-15?
Could you just go back up a page, please?
Yes, we go back to page 2, please.
What I'm not sure of is whether the text in italics was John Bean's words or whether that was the words from Andrew Maple.
According to Dave Cummins, in the email I've read to you, he believed that the text came from John Bean.
It just doesn't tie in with point number 6 on the next page.
Well, it might do. But, I mean, we can argue about the text of it. I mean, my question is, what was your understanding that you gleaned from Dave Cummins?
My understanding was that there was an awful lot of confusion, for want of a better word, as to whether K-15 was suitable for use, whether it was limited combustibility or what.
Right. you say there was confusion. You, I think, at least by this time, were not confused, and you knew that it wasn't a material of limited combustibility, being a phenolic.
Yes, I believe that's true.
Let's look at Steve Cook's response at the top of the email chain. You're copied in. If we go to the top, he says, and it's back to Dave Cummins, to you as well, copied to Steve Evans. The extract does not look like it came from John, and in any case, the PMs are advising customers that insulation in cavities on high-rise, over 18 metres, all needs to be of limited combustibility as per AD, approved document. Obviously, K-15 does not need a backing board wall. It is rigid and is attractive to customers, but does not have test evidence that it meets the limited combustibility rating. K-12 does need a backing board stroke wall and does have limited combustibility, so is okay for 18 metres plus, but is not as attractive as K-15 is to customers. So that's what Steve Cook says. When you saw that as you did you understand Steve Cook's message that K-15 is not material of limited combustibility, so despite the fact that it was attractive to customers, it couldn't be used over 18 metres?
Yes, I would agree with that, yes.
Do you know whether Diane Marshall's understanding about the use of K-15 changed at this time? Can you give us an insight into that?
I can't. I mean, I only recall that the issue was being bandied around within NHBC.
Right.
But, within really only the London-based teams of NHBC, and at that time I wasn't particularly involved with them, so I just heard it, on the grapevine, as it were.
Was, to your understanding, was NHBC still approving and warranting K-15 above 18 metres, despite the fact that it was combustible?
Yes, I believe they were, yes.
And was the basis of that no more than the fact that Kingspan was okaying it?
It would have been, well, I feel I'm commenting on an area that I really wasn't involved with, and, all I know is that all I can go off is the one or maybe two schemes which came across my desk at the time, which I looked at, which were, when we asked for advice from Kingspan, what we got was a copy of their marketing literature, a copy of the fire test, and a copy of the BBA certificate, and a copy of the LABC approval.
Yeah. But let me try it this way. You had no reason to think that at this point the NHBC had made a decision not to approve or warrant the use of K-15 above 18 metres.
I wasn't aware of any such decision, but...
So drawing the threads together so far, is it fair to say that as of October 2013, first, you were aware that K-15 was not a material of limited combustibility, yes?
Me personally, yes.
Yes. You were aware that approved document B said that materials in an external wall build-up over 18 metres, unless tested under BS 8414 to BR 135, had to be of limited combustibility, yes?
Yes.
And that at this time the NHBC were advising their customers that insulation on high-rise buildings should be of limited combustibility, yes?
Yes.
But despite that, K-15 was still being accepted by the NHBC, or at least hadn't been refused by NHBC.
Because I was also aware of the Regulation 7, which would suggest that, BBA approval could be taken as an alternative way of demonstrating compliance.
Did you at the time go and look at Regulation 7 and check whether the NHBC's reliance on it justified its then approach?
I didn't specifically know, but my understanding was that BBA certificates were an accepted way of demonstrating compliance under Regulation 7.
To your knowledge, did anybody at the NHBC double-check, verify that the approach that they were taking in the light of this knowledge was justified by Regulation 7? Did anybody do that?
Sorry,
Yes.
Please.
I'll repeat the question.
Please.
To your knowledge, did anybody at NHBC double-check that the approach that was being taken was justified by Regulation 7?
Well, I'm not aware anybody specifically went and double-checked it, but these, the Diane, Steve, they were people that had been in building control for many years, and the status of BBA certificates under Regulation 7 was well known.
Yes. I mean, did you understand, as the only qualified fire engineer in the organisation, that a BBA certificate was not Holy Writ?
Please, could you rephrase the question?
Yeah. That Regulation 7 did not give the status of conclusive evidence to a BBA certificate.
The whole building regulation system, nothing gave conclusive evidence on anything. It was about an approved inspector's role. Requirements were to take reasonable steps to see if, compliance with the building regulations was being achieved.
Can we then go to NHB 50585, which is an email of the 4th of October 2013 from Wintech. And this is from Chris Macy. If we go to the foot of page 1 and over to page 2, and I should just say this, I apologise for this. This will happen quite a lot in your examination where we split over a number of pages with these emails. Now Wintech weren't they, facade engineering consultants, yes?
Yes.
And they were reputable, weren't they?
As far as I knew, I didn't have a lot to do with facades at this time, but I had heard of them and knew that they were to be relied upon, yes.
Yes. Now, this email, as you can see, comes from Chris Macy, who is the managing director at Wintech, and it goes to Dave White, who is at NHBC, copied to Paul Savage, who was, I think, another Wintech colleague of his. And he says this, David, and if we go to page 2, it was good to meet at CWCT this week. As discussed, please find attached a document that infers that K-15 is suitable for all applications and is compliant with Part B. I've marked the relevant text in yellow. Our concern is that K-15 does not, as a material, meet the requirements of Part B of the building regulations in that it isn't of limited combustibility, quotes unquotes. The regulations do, however, allow the use of this material on buildings over 18 metres tall, subject to a specific test on the exact form of the construction used, or alternatively, a report from BRE that supports the use of the material based on an assessment of its specific application, or alternatively, if it's used in masonry constructions. The sales literature from Kingspan is not wrong in its content, but infers that all applications of the use of K-15 will be acceptable in all events, which we believe is not the case. K-15 is widely used in industry. Having spoken to BRE, we believe it should not be without the supporting report documentation or test data to confirm its acceptability, underlined, as the mode of failure can be affected by subtle changes in design that occur between forms of construction. I hope the attached and above are of assistance, and we would welcome the opportunity to discuss this with you further in due course. Now, you are not copied in on this email, but do you agree, or did you agree at the time, had you seen it, that his view, as expressed here, that to use K-15 over 18 metres to comply with ADB would require passing an 8414 test? Yes?
Yeah, everything he said in that email, I would not disagree with.
Right. Well, thank you.
But at the time, I'm not sure I was particularly reading that email.
Right. Okay. But you don't. There's nothing. Me showing that to you now. There's nothing you would disagree with.
No.
No. Now, before we move on to the subsequent meeting that the NHBC had the following month, November 2013, I just want to show you two more NHBC internal emails. First of all, NHB 50589. The first email at the foot of the chain, please. If you go to the last page, foot of the chain, you can see that this is from Paul Williams to Brian Stevenson, Steve Cook, Jerry Crouch, and Martin White. I think all internal, yes? You have to say yes.
Yes.
Not nod.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes.
Morning. Amanda Thorpe has received feedback from a customer that NHBC no longer accepts this on buildings above 18 metres as it's considered combustible. Is this something surveyors have been advised on? Just pausing there. Can you just tell her who Amanda Thorpe is?
She was one of the building control surveyors.
Right. Now, if we go up to the next email in the chain, which is the response from Steve Cook, which copies you in, he writes this. Most are aware, and we've discussed at ATM meeting, Steve Evans and John Lewis are looking to provide some better guidance at a meeting on the subject soon. And if we go to the top of the chain, we can see the response from Brian Stevenson to Steve Cook, Paul Williams, Jerry Crouch, Martin White, Steve Evans, you and Chris Cooley. I certainly wasn't, ! Please see attached our findings when this was last raised. Now, he attaches 3 documents to this email, one of which is Kingspan's K-15 marketing literature, and the other 2 are email chains of their own. Just pausing there, do you accept that at the end of 2013, or certainly in the last quarter of that year, employees at NHBC were not familiar with the building regulations in this respect and exceptions to where combustible materials could be used on buildings above 18 metres?
I'm not sure I can answer that. That Steve Cook was the manager of the team that was predominantly seeing the material used on high-rise buildings. I can't answer for what his instructions were to the teams or his understanding.
Well, let me put it to you this way. Did it surprise you that Brian Stevenson, who was an ATM, an area technical manager, wasn't aware that K-15 was not a material of limited combustibility?
I'm a little surprised that, yes, because, it was not something Kingspan were hiding. They data sheet and the BBA certificate, I believe, all said it was Class C. So it wasn't a thing that was difficult to find out.
Well, Class C isn't material of limited combustibility.
No, it's not. No. Sorry, I maybe misunderstood your question.
Let me try a slightly different question. Do you know how many buildings NHBC was signing off at this point, either through building control approval or through provision of warranties, where combustible materials such as K-15 was being used?
I don't. I can't put a figure. I honestly was not involved in any of those buildings up until, my involvement in this process really started with that first meeting with Wintech in November, and this was all before that. I knew it was all happening. I could hear the noises being made. I had only just joined as the specialist in about August of 2013, and there was an awful lot of other fire-related issues that I was been dealing with, and I knew that there was something that had to be grabbed hold of at some point, but I hadn't been asked to grab hold of it, and I had a lot of other things that were occupying my mind at the time.
But you had been asked to grab hold of it, hadn't you? Because Steve Cook's response, as I've read to you, was that you and Steve Evans were looking to provide some better guidance and would be meeting on the subject. So this was being put on your plate, wasn't it? Yeah,
but what I did was dictated by Steve.
Well, right, but you were involved in examining the question at this point.
Well, looking at that email, it appears that way, but I don't really recall any discussions between me and Steve, particularly up until, we met with Wintech. That was the time for me, that was the kind of watershed moment that it all started to crystallise, and I was focusing in on it.
Right, so just going back then to the email below it, we don't have it on the screen, but the one at the foot of page 1, please, if we scroll down to it, where Steve Cook says Steve Evans and John Lewis are looking to provide some better guidance and are meeting on the subject soon. Did you meet Steve Evans and discuss this subject?
Steve and I had, as I say, he was my direct manager. We had one-to-ones at least once a week. It's possible that, it was one of a number of subjects that were on that list of things of our to-do list.
Right.
But by that point, we hadn't really, I hadn't started to to do anything with it.
Right, but okay, to be clear, do you recall at this time, late October, agreeing with Steve Evans to sit down and look to improve the guidance?
I don't recall that, no.
Mr. Chairman, I've got one more document in this run, which will take about 5 minutes before we turn to the Wintech meeting in November 2013. I'd just like to finish off.
It'd be sensible to do that, I think.
Thank you, yes. Now, let's go then to NHB 50794. This is an email exchange a few days later, early November 2013. And if we go to the foot of page 3, please. This is an email of the 4th of November from Paul Williams to the Southwest Area Technical Team, as you can see there. He says, surveyors, all. Amanda raised a question on the use of Kingspan K-15 insulation in wall constructions and buildings over 18 metres. Steve Evans and John Lewis are currently reviewing whether we can accept this product for use in this situation, as we have doubts with respect to the combustibility aspect of the product. Now, just pausing there, is that correct? As a fact, were you currently reviewing whether NHBC could accept K-15?
We weren't, no. The issue, as I seem to recall, was that it had been raised to Steve and me. We were, we had it on our to-do list.
Well, maybe, a to-do list is exactly that. Was this question being examined at that time by you with a view to producing better guidance so that the NHBC could make a decision?
No, I don't think at that point, at the 4th of November, I don't think we were doing anything on it.
And why is that?
Well, for me, as I say, what I did was tightly controlled by Steve, and I believe he hadn't asked me to do it. I can't recall the timeline of when Dave's email about the meeting with Wintech. I don't know if this was crossing over at around that same time, and whether we were just waiting until we could meet with Wintech and understand it more before they went do something with it. I seem to recall Steve asking me before that meeting with Wintech to, what was the synopsis of things that we were going to discuss with Wintech. But I can't recall the timeline specifically.
Now let's go higher up to page 3, please, or higher up page 3, and we see here an email from Chris Cooley 4 days later, 8th of November 2013, to Brian Stevenson. You don't see this, but it forwards the query on from Amanda Thorpe that we have just seen and the promise of guidance. And Chris Cooley says this: Brian, any idea how long Steve and John will take, as we're involved with the design team meetings and need to pass on our requirements at the outset of the design process? If we're not going to accept K-15, what are the alternatives? As far as we're aware, there are no other foam insulation boards that meet the requirements, so all high-rise will be forced to use rock wool. As you can imagine, this will cause a major issue with our customers as they all use board insulation to gain their U values. I hope Steve is ready to take the barrage of inquiries. Now, you're copied into this email further up the chain when Steve Evans says he will update everyone after a meeting with Kingspan the following week. I don't need to show you that, but if we look at your statement, please, page 12, paragraph 47, we've looked at this before. You say there that Chris Cooley raised the question of the use of K-15 over 18 metres. You say in the last line there, Chris Cooley also raised it. Were you referring to this exchange we've just been looking at in November 2013?
No.
Right. So what are you referring to then?
There was another set of emails on a job where Chris was putting it forward, and I recall the email was saying Kingspan said it was all right without a backing board, and was that the case? And my advice back to Chris was that it was, why would we want to accept it without the backing board if it was meant to have the backing board? And my suggestion was, not that it was my decision to take, but my suggestion was that there wasn't enough evidence that we should accept it.
Can we just go back to look at the email that we've just been looking at, please, from Chris Cooley? It's the one at page 3 of NHB 50594. Page 3, please. Yes, that's the one. Now, just looking at that, you can see that he says there that all high-rise projects were using combustible rigid foam insulation predominantly for cost and to meet U values. We've seen that. Do you agree with what he says? Was that happening?
Sorry, where is this? Which?
In the middle of the paragraph. There are no other foam insulation boards that meet the requirements. And then, as you can imagine, this will cause a major issue with our customers as they all use board insulation to gain their U values. Do you agree with that?
I couldn't say whether all high-rise buildings were using it. I really was not heavily involved in the high-rise buildings at this time, so I have no reason to doubt with Chris, but we were well aware that there were other insulation products around at the time. I would doubt that it was all.
Right. Do you agree nonetheless that for NHBC to come out and say that they would no longer accept these forms of combustible insulation on high-rise buildings would, as Chris Cooley contemplates, subject NHBC to a barrage of inquiries?
Well, undoubtedly so, yes.
And that presumably would then have a potential knock-on effect on NHBC's business?
I don't think the issue of the business money side of it would have been the issue. I think at that point it would have been how to manage a lot of angry customers.
Yes. And did NHBC continue to accept K-15 in order to avoid the barrage of inquiries, as Chris Cooley put it?
No, we just, NHBC at the time wasn't afraid of tackling difficult subjects and difficult issues, and part of any regulator's role was at times that you would have to upset your customer and not let them have what they wanted, and that was understood and that was the way it operated.
Really? So you use the word regulator there. Is that how you saw the NHBC?
The building control services bit that I worked for as an approved inspector was a regulator, yes.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, is that a convenient moment?
Yes, thank you very much. Well, Mr. Lewis, we have a break during the morning and the afternoon, and this is a convenient time to take the break for the morning. So we'll stop there. We'll resume, please, at 20 to 12. And now you've started to give your evidence, it's very important that you don't discuss your evidence or anything relating to it with anyone. All right?
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Would you like to go with the usher, please? Thank you. 20 to 12, please. Okay. Could you ask Mr. Lewis to come back in, please? Right, Mr. Lewis, ready to carry on?
Thank you, yes.
Yes, thank you very much. Yes, Mr.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, thank you. Mr. Lewis, can I then take you back to paragraph 47 of your statement, page 12? We've examined it, I think, a number of times now. And you say in the last line there, or last sentence, however, for me, the issue really came to the forefront in November 2013 when Wintech raised it, as I referenced below at paragraph 50 onwards. Now, before we go to the meeting, let's go, please, to NHB 50604 and go to the bottom of the email chain on page 4, please. And you can see there that here is an email from you to Steve Evans, Graham Perrier, Dave White and Gary Jarvis, 15th of November 2013. And you say, some notes from this morning's meeting together with the first draft of an internal guidance note. Meeting was attended by Stuart Taylor, Wintech, David Watakabe, Wintech, Graham Perrier, Dave White, John Lewis. So you were there, yes?
Yes.
Yes. Now we'll look at the guidance note that you circulated shortly, but just looking at the notes of the meeting, we can see that at point 2, it says, Wintech outlined the route to compliance as recommended in ADB 2, and then there are 4 bullet points underneath that. Let's just look at the first 2. Para 12.7 of ADB 2 refers to the limited combustibility requirement of all elements of a cladding system, including the insulation and external facing material. The exclusions are smaller gasket parts and similar low-risk items. ADB 2 previously referred to the insulation alone needing to be of limited combustibility, but the latest document changed this to include all larger elements. Second bullet point, use of a mulch, material of limited combustibility, will meet the requirements of ADB 2 and so B4. The definition is stated in Table A7 of ADB 2. For European classifications, the key issue is that it achieves either an A1 or A2 rating. Now, looking at those first 2 bullet points as I've read to you, do you know why what you've said there had to be spelt out to your colleagues?
I think because it was an area that I hadn't really researched, and having it spelt out to me by Wintech and then me then going and reading it all again for myself, it sort of, yes, we kind of already knew it, but we hadn't sat and got it all clear in our heads and started to put it down on together right. In a situation.
I see.
And so I thought that, well, if that was me, probably the best thing to do is put it down in writing and try and put it in, simple terms so that when I came back to it, it was clear to me again and it would be clear to everybody else.
Right. So do we take it from that answer that what's written in those 2 bullet points there was not second nature to you before the meeting?
Sorry, do you mean, did I know that all already?
Yes.
Well, yes, we kind of did, but we hadn't put it together and joined all the dots with relation to combustible insulation in high-rise buildings before.
Now,
this was the first attempt to do that.
Right. Now, looking at the 3rd bullet point, which is quite long, I'll read it to you. The alternative route, para 12.5, is for the client to submit evidence to us that the complete proposed external cladding system has been assessed according to the acceptance criteria in BR 135. The method of determining this is to carry out a fire test in accordance with BS 8414 Part 1 if the cladding is fixed to the face of an external masonry or concrete external wall, or BS 8414 Part 2 if the cladding is fixed to and supported by a structural steel frame. The BS 8414 tests do not give a pass-fail answer because the data obtained is used by different bodies with different minimum requirements. However, for building regs, any test using this method needs to be supported by proof that the acceptance criteria of BR 135 have been met. Refer to pages 19 and 23 of BR 135 2013 for details of these. Again, was that well known, second nature to you before the meeting, or was this something that you took away from the meeting and then checked out for yourself?
I wouldn't say it was second nature. I did know BR135. At this point, I don't think I'd read it for quite a while before this. And I did know, that 8414 testing was there. Again, I hadn't joined up the dots, as it were.
Right. Now let's look at the fourth bullet point down. It says this: the client may instead submit a desktop study report from BRE, stating whether, in BRE's opinion, BRE 135 criteria will have been met. Such a report will be based upon test data which BRE already has in its possession, and so this option will be of no benefit if the products have not already been tested by BRE in multiple situations or arrangements. Other test bodies, Chiltern, Warrington Fire, etc., would also be acceptable, but these bodies are not known to have any test data. Do you know where that idea, captured by that bullet point, came from? Did it come from the Wintech side alone, or did it come from NHBC, at least in part?
No, I believe that came from Wintech.
Right. So, to your knowledge, was this the first time that you had heard this approach mentioned as an alternative to the use either of a material of limited combustibility above 18 metres or satisfying the BR135 criteria after a BS8414 test?
Yes, I believe that was the first time that I'd heard of it, and I believe that Wintech stated it because they had, on some other schemes, not ones that we'd been involved with that I was aware of, that was how it had been accepted by other building control bodies.
Right, so to shorten that answer, you'd understood from that Wintech had got a desktop from BRE that other inspectors had approved?
Maybe not Wintech, but they were obviously aware that a scheme had been approved on the basis of a desktop study from BRE on some other scheme.
Right, but that was news to you?
That was the first time I'd heard it, yes.
Now then, moving on to paragraph 3, thermosetting insulants, if we just scroll down, please. Thermosetting insulants, rigid polyurethane foam boards are combustible. One large manufacturer undertook a successful BR135 BS8414 Part 1 test using their insulation as part of the cladding build-up and are now stating that it is an acceptable product for use in walls exceeding 18 metres. However, this statement appears to be flawed because, first bullet, the test was to BS8414 Part 1, cladding fixed to the face of an external masonry concrete external wall, hence it cannot be applied to a cladding system proposed to be supported on a steel-framed building. Bullet 2, the test result can only be used if the same combination of materials, fixing arrangements, is used. Any deviation from the tested scenario negates the result. Bullet 3, as far as can be ascertained, this is the only test that BRE have undertaken on this product, and so, as there is only one set of results, it is difficult to draw any reliable conclusions. And then it goes on. Hence, whereas a cladding system using a polyurethane foam insulant may be successfully tested in future, the insulant alone cannot be considered as being a mulch. Now, when it refers there to the one large manufacturer, did you understand who it was to whom Wintech was referring?
Yes, it was Kingspan.
Kingspan. Now, let's look at point 6 on the next page, please, page 5. Class 0 does not infer any resistance to combustibility. It is solely a measure of the spread of flame across the surface. Now, was that news to you?
No, it wasn't. I knew that already.
You knew that already?
Yeah.
What about your colleagues, from what you could tell?
I can't answer for them.
Right.
There was a lot of misunderstanding, confusion.
I'm just looking at clause or paragraph 6. It's not right, is it, in fact, that class 0 is solely a measure of spread of flame across the surface? There's another aspect to achieving class 0 as well, isn't there?
Yeah, I mean, I think at the time I was just basically writing out Wintech's words.
Right.
But, the inference was just because it's Class O doesn't mean it's non-combustible, and that was, the inference of that paragraph.
Yes, I mean, we might come back to this in due course, but did you understand at the time that, in fact, Class 0 was achieved by passing two separate BS 476 tests. Part 7, which is surface spread of flame, but also Part 6, fire propagation.
I can't be sure that at the time I knew the full process to get to Class O. I knew that it was one step beyond Class 1, and so it required more testing, but I wouldn't have known the details probably at that stage.
Right. Is that not something that you would have learnt in the process of obtaining your qualification as a fire engineer?
Not really, no.
Really?
No, because the fire engineering master's degree, it dealt with principles. It wasn't skewed towards dealing with, the way the UK deals with it. You learnt how flames elongated, how flames reacted with surfaces.
Right.
It wasn't tied in with the UK building regulatory system or the British standard system.
Did it teach you anything about the testing and classification systems in use either in the UK or in Europe?
No, it didn't.
It didn't?
No. It wasn't that sort of, it was a more academic, fundamentals of this is how flames travel across surfaces, this is how they can elongate, this is, how they cling to surfaces, this is how to calculate the length of a flame, things like that. It was all, a lot of it was international stuff,
Right. Did you have any education then as part of that qualification on the building regulations and approved document B?
Approved document B, I can remember the first time I came into contact with, obviously, was 1994 when I started at local authority, and I believe we did have some training on it then. And I do recall that the 2006 version, I mentioned Mike Tucker, and I know that Mike was involved in some of the working groups that led up to the publication of the 2006 version. And so when it was published, Mike Tucker put together some training that taught us how, what the changes were that were in the 2006 version. I also recall that I took a lot of that training and I was delivering a lot of that training on the 2006 version to other people within NHBC.
Right. Well, we might come back to that in due course, if I may. Can we just park that? Looking at point 7 on this email, he says, or you say, rather, there's a problem that other BCBs are not applying the criteria. This is likely to be as a result of a lack of knowledge. We should be aware that by following the above approach, we may be seen as being awkward or obstructive if another BCB is willing to accept it. As such, should the issue be raised via the Building Control Alliance, etc., question, Wintech would be willing to give talks or presentations on the subject. Now, was this a record of the discussion at the meeting, or was it a side note to your NHBC colleagues?
The first sentence about problem with other BCBs not applying it, that was from Wintech. The second sentence, likely to be a lack of knowledge, would be in Wintech. And then the next part would have been my own words.
Right. So the next part being the next sentence.
Well, the next three sentences, yes.
2 sentences, and then the last sentence. Did Wintech tell you at the meeting that they would be willing to provide the education?
Yes, otherwise I wouldn't have put that down.
Yeah. And now, you were a member, I think, of the BCA at the time, or were you not?
No, I wasn't.
You weren't. Do you know who raised the idea of having the BCA issue guidance on this question?
Looking at that sentence, I'm guessing that myself and Steve must have discussed it at some point around this time. Steve was the one that had the links into the BCA, so it would have come from Steve.
He wasn't at the meeting, though, was
No,
he?
he wasn't, no.
So it would have been a discussion after the meeting, is that right? That would have had to have been.
Well, I can't recall for sure, but we must have had some discussions before this meeting, because I seem to remember Steve, the day before, asking me for a synopsis of what we were likely to discuss. So we must have had discussions around this time as to, what we were likely to be talking about with Wintech. And I guess for some reason Steve wasn't able to make the meeting, and so, he was just keeping tabs on what we were discussing and why and things like that.
So did you go into the meeting knowing already that at least BCA members would need to be educated on this subject?
I don't recall that. I mean, it may have been a discussion, I'm guessing here, this is, because it was so long ago, but it may have been Steve saying, well, if there's if it's a significant issue, maybe we should go via BCA rather than internally within NHBC.
Now, paraphrasing some of the email above this chain, we can see, and I'm summarising it for you, you forward the notes on to Brian Stevenson. He responds, this is on page 3 on the 19th of November. If we can scroll up to that, please, page 3. And he asks whether he can refer to the guidance note you've attached to the email and we'll come back to at his next team meeting. And then if we go to page 2, same day, 19th November, if we go up to page 2, you can see that you respond that it's only in draft. You see that? Mm-hmm. And then if we go to the next email up in the chain, higher up on page 2, later the same day, we can see that Steve Evans writes to you and Brian Stevenson, copied to, among others, Diane Marshall, and says, "Hi all, I have a BCA technical meeting on 9th December. If we can format this note into the BCA format, I can get it tabled and hopefully agreed as BCA policy guidance. John, how will this affect the Kingspan board that sparked, pardon the pun, the issue off?" Now, were any of those people copied into this email members of the BCA?
I believe, I think Diane held a position at the BCA.
And was this draft that's referred to, and we will look at it in a moment, was the first draft of what eventually became BCA Technical Guidance Note 18, published the following year in the June?
Yes.
Yes. And if we go to your response, above this, at 16:09 on the same day, 19th of November, you say this: "Hello, Steve, no problem. I'll change the format and recirculate it. From what I gather from Wintech, Kingspan K-15 was tested in one instance on a masonry wall construction. On this basis, Kingspan claimed that it's suitable for use in buildings over 18 metres high. But when you dig down to the detail, it's only acceptable if the wall construction is exactly the same as that tested. Most of our schemes are steel framed and with a METSEC or similar external wall build-up, and so the Kingspan test doesn't hold true. And if we follow the ADB and BR135 guidance, we shouldn't be accepting it. Even with a cementitious liner board, the product is still combustible and so doesn't meet ADB2 recommendations. According to Wintech, Kingspan proposed to test multiple combinations of cladding, liner and insulation, but didn't see this through after the first test. Hope this helps." Did any of your colleagues at NHBC express any dissent from the view that you've set out here?
No, not that I recall.
Can we therefore conclude that at least by mid-November 2013, if not before that, the NHBC as an organisation was aware that it should not be accepting combustible materials in external wall build-ups of walls over 18 metres, buildings over 18 metres, except in the specific circumstances identified by Wintech?
Well, as I say, you had the ADB route, and then running alongside that was the BBA Regulation 7 route. So you could not...
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but you've mentioned Regulation 7 various times. Can we just make it clear what you're referring to?
Yeah, Regulation 7 is a standard which deals with materials and workmanship. It gives various ways that materials can be deemed to be suitable.
This is the building regulation?
Yes, sorry, yes.
Thank you very much.
Yes. And Mr. Chairman, I think we examined it with Mr. Evans, and if need be, we can come back to it.
We may need to, yes. Thank you.
Now, subject to that question, can we then go back to your statement, please, at page 13? Paragraph 53, towards the bottom of page 13, and page 54 over the top. You say at 53, "I recall during the meeting that Wintech went through the ADB routes to compliance, as I'd only been in my specialist role for a few weeks, and in that time had been dealing with other fire safety issues. I had not focused on this issue to the extent that it was discussed during the meeting. After the meeting, I looked further into this issue, and it was clear to me that Wintech was right. As a result, I drafted an email dated 15th November 2013 to set out these issues in order for the key people in NHBC to consider this carefully." And then you go on at 54. From my point of view, Wintech was a reliable source of information. In their role, they generally designed good, robust external wall systems from a fire safety point of view. They would often specify materials of limited combustibility. However, it was my experience that the building companies would often look to change the specification, given that products like K-15 could be used in a thinner version of the wall makeup. I suspect Wintech may have been frustrated by this. Nonetheless, I considered they were motivated by raising a genuine fire safety concern and saw NHBC as a body that would assist with addressing this. Now, after receiving the information from a company whom you considered reliable and motivated by genuine concerns of fire safety, did NHBC make any changes in its approach to accepting combustible materials in wall build-ups over 18 metres?
Well, the guidance notes, that was the start of the process of, making the change.
Right. That was published in June 2014, so that's...
No, I believe...
7 months later.
No, I believe Steve sent out an email in December 2014 clarifying to some extent NHBC's policy.
You're right, that's 2014. We're still in 2013.
That was straight after this process.
No, we're in 2013.
Sorry.
We're in November 2013 here.
Yeah, but I thought... I may be getting my dates confused, but I thought that Steve sent out some email not long after this to clarify matters to some degree.
Well, we'll come to look at an early December email from Steve Evans later. But
yes,
I think the answer to my question is technical guidance note 18, and that took, I think, as a matter of record, until June 2014 to publish. Yes. That's its date. Issue 0, June 2014.
it must have been then.
But you take it from me,
Yes.
and we are going to look at it in detail
Yeah.
shortly. Let me approach the question in a slightly different way. Did NHBC stop accepting Kingspan K-15 in high-rise buildings and indeed any other combustible materials in high-rise buildings over 18 metres in and from November 2013?
Not that I'm aware of, no.
Why not?
I wasn't the one that would have taken any of those decisions.
That's not not an answer to the question. Do you know the reason why NHBC persisted in accepting K-15 and indeed possibly other combustible materials in build-ups of walls, external walls, in buildings over 18 metres after November 2013?
All I can recall, like I say, is that the reference to the BBA certificate indicated that there was a route to compliance via that way. And therefore, NHBC didn't see a need to stop using K-15. And the questions, particularly at that time, were related to K-15.
Now, I've read you the detailed minute record of the meeting you had with Wintech. From what I've read to you, we've seen no record there of any reference to Regulation 7. Is that because there was no discussion of Regulation 7 at that meeting?
Yes, the notes from the meeting were, from what I recall, were Wintech and the route through the ADB.
Do we take it from that there was no discussion of Regulation 7 between NHBC and Wintech at that meeting?
I don't recall one, no.
No. And if Regulation 7 was something which, as you understood it at the time, blessed or sanctified the approach that was being taken by the NHBC to accepting K-15 over 18 metres for the time being, can you explain why that wasn't discussed?
No, I can't, but it was on the back of, after the Wintech meeting, that was when we wrote to Kingspan and said, please tell us why your product, paraphrased, please tell us why your product is considered okay for use on tall buildings. And Kingspan, I believe, came back with the BBA certificate as one of their supporting reasons.
Now, you, I think, had no further contact with Wintech after this meeting.
No.
And why did NHBC not have any further contact with Wintech after this meeting, given that they had raised genuine fire concerns and had offered to assist in public education on the point?
Well, most of the dealing with Wintech was via, Dave White's area of the warranty standards side. That was most of what the contact with Wintech I understood was to do with things, relating to, water ingress and things like that.
Right.
As far as I know, Wintech were still being dealt with via people in the NHBC on a fairly regular basis. Me personally, that was the one and only time I really came into contact with them.
Was there a concern at the NHBC, so far as you could detect it, that Wintech might well find out that the NHBC had been signing off buildings, many buildings, containing K-15 or other combustible materials purely on the say-so of the manufacturer, when that material was not a material of limited combustibility and there was no supporting BS 8414 test?
Sorry, what was the first part of the question?
Well, was there a concern generally within NHBC that Wintech might discover that NHBC historically had been signing off many buildings above 18 metres which contained combustible materials in the external wall build-up without a BS 8414 test either?
I suspect that Wintech knew of a lot of buildings that were being signed off with K-15, not just ones at NHBC, but, of many, or probably all the building control bodies.
Right. Now, you I think, have confirmed to us that there was no discussion of Regulation 7 at this time. Was there any internal consideration of Regulation 7 within NHBC to ensure, in light of what Wintech had told you at the meeting and all the dots being joined up as you've told us, nonetheless, Regulation 7 might provide assistance to NHBC?
I'm trying to recall specifically, but I know that Steve and I had plenty of discussions, and most likely after this meeting, one or other of us would have said, we better see what the BBA certificate says and see if that supports, because that was generally the next place you went to as a building control surveyor.
Right. We've seen nothing in the documents to suggest that there was any active consideration of Regulation 7 to see if it assisted the NHBC in the way in which you have told us. Can you explain why?
Well, it was the way building control people did it. You would say, pull out the BBA certificate, let's have a look at that. We wouldn't formalise a procedure of checking it under Regulation 7. Regulation 7 referred to BBA certificates generally. Building control bodies accepted BBA certificates.
Right. Well, let's look at Regulation 7, shall we, just briefly. INQ 30 please. Here it is, Regulation 7, Materials and Workmanship. If we go to page 13, we can see paragraphs 1.15 and 1.16 under the heading Independent Certification Scheme. Just looking at those there, I won't read them out to you, but did you look at those paragraphs in October or November 2013 in the context of the problem that you were discussing with Wintech at the meeting in November 2013?
No, I didn't specifically, but it was just known throughout building control that BBA certificates were accepted the full route to how that happened and came up and, where it was written in which approved document, I must have read at some point in the past, but, it wasn't at the forefront and I didn't go back to check it, no.
Right, thank you. Now,
So the position actually is that this is not Regulation 7, of course, is it?
this is regulation. This is within
This
regulation.
is an approved document, I think, isn't it?
No, this is. We can go back. Let's go back to page 1.
It
This is the approved document. It's approved document 7.
It's the
Yes,
approved
it's not
document.
regulation.
But it is called regulation 7.
No, it may be called Regulation 7, but when people refer to Regulation 7, and Mr. Lewis says he means Building Regulation 7, that is not what we're looking at. Building Regulation 7 says very little. It says nothing about BBA certificates as such. It just says you've got to do the work with the right materials in the right way.
Well, correct. I mean, that is true.
This
we
is-
can
this is,
happily look at that, Mr. Chairman.
No, we don't need to look at it. I have looked at it.
Right.
But what we're now looking at, just for clarity, is an approved document, as it says.
Yeah.
Is it not?
Let me try it this way with the witness. Mr. Lewis, when you refer to Regulation 7 in your evidence this morning, were you referring to this document on the screen in front of us?
Well, this is the approved document that supports Regulation 7. Regulation 7 says you must use materials fit for purpose,
Yeah.
and then the guidance as to what could be considered that is what's contained in this approved document, yes.
And it may be that I went too swiftly to the approved document in support of Regulation 7. But is the part of this approved document supporting Regulation 7 that which you were intending to refer this morning when you referred to Regulation 7?
Yes, because that's the part that discusses independent certification schemes.
It does. And
the BBA certificates were considered to be an independent certification scheme.
And I think, just to confirm, you didn't look at those paragraphs in October, November 2013?
I didn't, simply because it was already established and well known that BBA certificates are acceptable.
Now, let's go to your statement. Paragraph 48, if we can, please, on page 13. I'm sorry, it's the foot of page 12, I think we need. Paragraph 48. And you say there, after the Wintech meeting, I considered what they were saying, read ADB closely, and realised this was a potential issue. That is when I realised the issue needed to be escalated. I wrote to the Kingspan Technical Helpline on 26 November 2013. Now, did you escalate this issue within NHBC?
Yes, the email I wrote after the Wintech meeting was to Steve and Diane. They were...
I see. So that was your escalation.
Yes. As well as I say, Steve and I had regular discussions about what I was doing and workload and what needed to be done.
Right. Now, at that time, so after the Wintech meeting and after your report of it to those individuals within NHBC, were there any changes made to the practice of accepting combustible products on buildings over 18 metres within NHBC?
Not immediately straight after this, no.
Not immediately. When?
After we'd gone to Kingspan, found out their reference to BBA certificates, looked at it a bit more, found the LABC certificate, things like that. And that was the point that then I think Steve wrote an email to the surveyors.
That's 2015.
No, I thought there was an email from Steve in December 2013, straight after this process.
Yes, and you said so. We'll have to look at that together. But before we do, let's look at paragraph 49 while we have it. You say, at the end of 2013, I knew anecdotally of projects where NHBC had provided warranty or building control where the external wall arrangement specified a combustible material in buildings which were over 18 metres. I do not know of a report in 2013 which lists projects and combustible materials. NHBC systems are not set up in a way where I can filter by buildings over 18 metres and where they used a specific combustible material. I'm aware that in 2015 a project review was carried out, which is addressed later in my statement. So, is it right that despite knowing that this was an issue, in other words, K-15 should not be used above 18 metres, in the absence of a specific BS 8414 test for the specific build-up. Nothing was done within NHBC by way of changing the approvals process until a project review in 2015, more than a year later.
Other than, as I say, the email, I believe, was around December 2013. Apart from that, the only things that changed was then later on when we found out that the BBA certificate had changed again, but that was not until around about January, February of 2014.
Now, if we go to the attachment next of to your email, this is the first draft of the internal guidance note, NHB 50605. If we look at that, we can see that it's headed Use of Combustible Cladding Materials in Residential Buildings. And it's a draft on which we can see track changes which come from Steve Evans, as he's confirmed to us. Do you know why it was headed Combustible Cladding Materials?
We just named it something along those lines. It was a first draft. It would have been my choice of words.
Yes. Why did you choose the word cladding?
Because the issue was of, the build-up of the insulation and the cladding finishes and all the other components. That was the issue of, that was under consideration.
Right. So when you use the word cladding, you were referring to the entire external wall build-up, were you?
Yes.
Not rain screen.
Yes, because I believe we tied it in with the wording in Regulation B41, which talked about the external walls should not be a medium for fire spread.
Yes, I see. Had you had any discussion with Wintech, as well as talking about insulation, on the subject of rain screen panels and specifically ACM with a polyethylene core? Did that come up?
This is all hazy because it was so long ago, but I do recall Wintech saying along the lines of, and it's not just the insulation, you need to be careful about the external finish materials. But I didn't record that down as such, and the focus at the time, I recall, was very much upon the insulation material being the risk.
And if we look then about a third of the way down the page, it says there, external surfaces. It's about halfway down your screen. Can you see that? And it says change to all, external surfaces should comply with diagram 40 of ADB2. What was your understanding at the time of what diagram 40 of ADB2 required?
Well, diagram 40 was giving guidance on, fire spread across wall surfaces. So, we knew that there was the two issues of combustibility and flame spread, surface spread of flame. And diagram 40 was talking about the surface spread of flame, both of the side of the wall facing outwards and the side of the external finish facing into the cavity in certain situations.
Yeah. And we'll come back to that. And you go on to say further down the page, under the heading combustibility of cladding components in buildings exceeding 18 metres in height, you say this: where the building exceeds 18 metres in height, paragraph 12.7 of ADB2 refers to the need for limited combustibility of all elements of a cladding system. This includes the insulation, internal lining board, and the external facing material. The exclusions are smaller gasket parts and similar low-risk items. Now, what did you mean by external facing material there?
The part of the external wall system that was outermost.
Right. Was it your understanding that all elements of the cladding system, by which I mean the entire external wall build-up, including the, as you put it, outermost elements, had to be of limited combustibility?
Yes, it was, because in 2012, I believe I wrote an email to the BRE asking exactly that question as to whether they considered paragraph 12.7 did refer to and did include the external cladding panels. And BRE wrote back and said, well, they didn't quite commit on it because they said interpretation of ADB is not for them, and then they gave words along the lines of, yes, but it makes sense that you need to consider all the parts of an external wall that would affect how a fire was to spread up it.
Yes. Now, we'll come to see if we can identify that exchange shortly, very shortly. But before we do, I think you answered the question. Your understanding of the requirements of ADB was rooted in that exchange, was it?
Yes.
I see. Did you, either at this time or at any earlier time than this, November 2013, consider that what you've written in that paragraph there was different from what 12.7 of ADB actually said?
Yes, we were well aware that paragraph 12.7 of ADB didn't specifically refer to the external cladding panel. But the wording of paragraph 12.7 said any insulation, filler material, etc. And by virtue of the etc., my interpretation was that the sentence was inferring that, you know, all parts of the external wall or major components of it need to be materials of limited combustibility.
And it goes on to say here, just following this chain of reasoning through, if I may, Mr. Lewis, therefore the use of a material of limited combustibility for these components will satisfy the requirements of section 12 of ADB 2 and part B4. The definition of a MULC, material of limited combustibility, is stated in table A7 of ADB 2. So taking those two paragraphs together, what was your understanding of complying with both diagram 40 and 12.7?
They related to two separate sections of approved document B, and both sections, you know, were intended to be considered by a building control body or a building designer. So
was it your understanding, therefore, that an external cladding system had to comply with both diagram 40 and 12.7, or was compliance with diagram 40 enough, so far as the rain screen was concerned?
No, both aspects had to be complied with.
Did you therefore turn your mind to how that was so, given that a material of limited combustibility, if you look at table A7, had to be A1 or A2 in the Euro class, or satisfy BS 476 part 11 in the national class, whereas under diagram 40, it required only that the external wall material be class 0 or class 2 Euro class?
Well, this was one of the things with ADB. It had things in it which were slightly at odds, slightly confusing, and hadn't really been bottomed out. But the approach we took was we knew that both aspects needed to be considered. I mean, you know, noting that ADB was just a guidance document, but our interpretation was that you had to consider both the combustibility aspect, where it was over 18 metres tall, as well as the surface spread of flame aspects listed in diagram 40.
Did it occur to you at the time that there might be an inconsistency between 12.7, as you read it, applying to all elements, and diagram 40 applying to the external surface, because diagram 40 only required class B, Euro class, which was not material of limited combustibility?
Yeah, we were aware that there was an inconsistency, yes, but in our view, paragraph 12.7 was quite clear. Once you go over 18 metres, these materials need to be material limited combustibility.
So do we take it from that the NHBC's thinking, evolving, of course, though it was at this time, through this drafting process, that they would require rain screen panels used above 18 metres to be class A1 or A2, materials of limited combustibility, and that class B would not be sufficient, despite what diagram 40 said?
If you are following the linear route of ADB specifically, yes, that was our interpretation.
Right. And was that put into practice?
This was the start of that process, drafting this guidance, which then made its way, conveyed to the surveyors as a NHBC
Yes.
way of doing things.
Indeed. So the start of the process, which turned into option 1, as we'll come to see, I think you will recall, in TGN 18 in June 2014, meant that if option 1 was going to be pursued, diagram 40 had to be overridden by 12.7. In other words, you would reject a Class B panel.
If the route to compliance was citing those, that route through the approved document B, then yes, that would not be a correct way of doing it.
Yeah, thank you. Now let's just to be very clear, was it your understanding at the time that when you say all elements, that included a core of an ACM panel?
Yes, I mean, we said all elements, really we meant all the big elements, things like the minor fixings and things possibly were not a big risk. But the largest components of the wall system all needed to meet the material limited combustibility, and that, as I say, the core of the ACM would have been included by virtue of the etc. wording in 12.7.
I want to then look at the exchange you had with the BRE that you told us about and see if we can identify it. Can we please go to NHB 402971? Now, this is an email chain between you, Mr. Lewis, and Tony Baker from the BRE in the May of 2013. And therefore, just placing it in its chronology, it's before you started in your position as a specialist fire engineer in the August of that year, and before you were alerted to the issues with K-15 by Steve Cook. And if we go to the first email in the chain on page 2, please, it's from you to him, Tony Baker, 10th of May 2013, and it's copied to Brian Stevenson and others. John Greenhalgh and Chris Myers, who are they? Can you just tell us?
John Greenhalgh, at the time, he was either a commercial building control manager. I think John was my manager at the time. He was the manager of the commercial building control. Chris Myers was one of the building control surveyors, I believe.
Yes. Now, Tony Baker is your contact there, and you say, "Dear Tony, I hope you're well. Please forgive the direct approach in this way, but I wondered if I could seek your opinion, straight clarification, of an issue relating to the combustibility of cladding systems in high-rise premises, in this case a block of flats." Now, just pausing there, did you know Tony Baker, or were you put in touch with him by somebody else?
No, it was... I'd sent him an email, I believe, on a different matter in 2012.
Right.
Yes, that was it. I'd sent him an email in 2012 asking about a cavity barrier interpretation, which I think I'd sent to Sarah Colwell, and Tony Baker had replied. So as I had him, and knowing that he was likely to respond, I wrote straight back to him.
I see. So the 2012 discussion was about cavity barriers?
I think it was,
right.
Yes.
Okay. Well, let's look at this. Continuing with the email, ADB, diagram 40 states that external surfaces of cladding systems at this height should be of Class B S3D2. Paragraph 12.9, not applicable, in this case due to the residential nature, also states a requirement for the surfaces which face into the cavity to be of a similar rating. Para 12.7 states that any insulation product, filler material, etc., should be of limited combustibility. For this, we take the Table A7 definition as being a material achieving Class A2, S3, D2 or better, a classification which is higher than that for the surfaces. Rightly or wrongly, my interpretation has been that 12.7 includes the cladding panels themselves, as it seems logical to expect these to perform equally as well as the insulation in a fire situation. As I understand it, the issues are of fire spread across the surfaces of the materials, as well as combustibility of the system. BS 9999 and 9991 have similarly worded clauses. Is this a correct interpretation? Many thanks in advance for your help. It's appreciated. Now, first, do you remember what it was in May 2013 that prompted you to write this email?
No, I don't recall, but it must have been an issue raised most likely by Chris and or possibly Brian. It must have come from them because I didn't work in the same team as Chris. It must have been a query that he'd said, and someone had asked me, what do you think?
I see. And how had you come to the interpretation of 12.7 that you described there? Did you sit down and read it? Did you do some research on it? Did you ask colleagues? What did you do?
No, it just made sense that why make an insulant non-combustible when you're only going to clad it in the face with something that was combustible? You know, the inference of Regulation B41 was that the external wall needed to restrict or inhibit fire spread.
Right. And do you know what the problem was that prompted Chris or Brian to raise it with you?
I can't recall.
Right. Now let's go up to the response from Tony Baker. He comes back to you, if we go up the page, to page 1, please. He comes back to you on the 13th of May, 2013, 3 days later. And this is copied to the same people, but also copied internally within the BRE to Philip Carney. And he says this: John, thanks for your email. We would consider that all significant elements, layers of the cladding system should be considered as part of the overall fire risk assessment for the cladding system. And therefore, this would include the insulation, cavities within the cladding system, and the external layer, render system, or rain screen cladding panels, and obviously use and positioning of fire/cavity barriers. It is difficult to be specific as there are many different types of system available, and ADB itself refers mainly to the insulation. Also, as ADB is essentially a guidance document, it is the responsibility of the relevant authorities to ultimately decide on the applicability of specific standards and classifications for any given system design. That being said, BRE have conducted many large-scale fire tests on cladding systems of varying design, and it is clear that the fire performance depends on the overall system design and not necessarily just on individual component material classifications. Now, looking at the first part of that answer, did you interpret Tony Baker's response to your question to mean that 12.7 included the cladding panels or any elements of the cladding panels themselves?
It clarified my interpretation that that paragraph in ADB was referring to all the larger components of a wall build-up, yes.
As you said, including the core of a rain screen panel.
Yes.
Yes. So, can we take it from this email and what you've just told us about it, that some 6 months before your meeting with Wintech and the draft that you circulate that we've just looked at, you were advised by the BRE that all elements of the external wall build-up, including cladding, its core, and the insulation, should be of materials of limited combustibility?
Yes.
Yes. Did you have any reason to question Tony Baker's advice there?
As I say, it fitted with my reading of and thinking.
Did you bring his advice to the attention of your senior colleagues at NHBC?
As you can see there, Brian and John were both in my John was my manager at the time. Brian was on the same managerial level as John.
Yes, so you just assumed that they read it and understood it as you had?
Well, obviously Chris and John had brought the query to me. I can't remember why, but obviously they had raised the query. They'd sought my opinion. I'd gone back to them. Where it went from there on, I kind of left to them.
Can we look then at your witness statement, please, at page 15, paragraph 61A in the middle of the page, middle of your screen there. And you say there, before January 2014, prior to us knowing about any concerns, there was no particular policy. We knew K-15 was being used, and we would have seen the marketing literature which advises it is fit for use, along with the previous version of the BBA certificate which supported its use prior to 2013. Now, can you explain why it was that, despite having received Tony Baker's advice in the May of 2013, NHBC failed to put it into practice straight away?
No, I can't, because I was not in a position where I would have even been at the managers' meeting when it was discussed, and I was not in a position of setting any policy. My role was simply to give advice when I was asked.
Right. Did the NHBC, to your knowledge, have any particular policy in relation to combustible cladding panels in 2013?
I'm not aware of an official policy, no.
So does that tell us that, so far as you were aware, they were being accepted even if they were not materials of limited combustibility or comprised of such?
I can only comment for the times when I was asked, do I think that this complied or not? And I would give the advice in the case of an ACM that, by this time we knew of various fires around the world involving that material.
Yeah.
And if it came across my desk, I would have said, it doesn't comply, it should not be used.
And there were occasions when that happened, I think you say?
There were one or two, yes. I can't recall, and I haven't got specific emails, I don't think, of where that did happen. But like I say, by 2013, there'd been, in 2012 specifically, there were quite a few fires around the world, particularly in the Middle East, I believe, involving the material. I knew about them, and that was my view. It did not comply.
Right. Yes, thank you. Now, going back to Tony Baker's email, if we can, NHB 402971, in the second paragraph, I've not shown you that. You looked at the first paragraph. He says this: the classification document BR135, Fire Performance of External Thermal Insulation for Walls of Multi-Storey Buildings, has recently been revised and up-issued to the third edition. It may be useful for you to obtain a copy of this as it gives some useful information. In addition, LPCB, Fire and Security Certification arm of BRE Global, have published 2 LPS standards for external cladding systems, LPS 1581 and LPS 1582. These standards use the same core test methodology, BS 8414, but the criteria are higher than that of BR 135, having been developed to provide additional property protection requirements for insurers. Did you look at either of those 2 documents, LPS 1581 or 1582, at the time?
I certainly looked at them. I can't recall if it was at that time or whether it was later. I certainly had reviewed both those documents.
And you'll know from that review that indeed those 2 documents do provide higher standards, don't they?
They do, but they were geared towards the insurance industry rather than the regulatory control.
I understand, and indeed that is what Tony Baker says in effect. Now, if we go back to your first draft of the BCA Technical Guidance Note as it stood in November 2013, that's NHB 50605, please. And let's go to page 2 of that document. You can see there that you, in the first paragraph there, you provide for testing the complete proposed build-up to BR 135. I'm summarising it, but that's what you've referred to there. Yes?
Well, yes,
and
testing is to 8414.
Indeed, and it's very similar to what you set out in the note, as you took from the Wintech meeting, having joined up the dots.
Yes.
Yes. And when did you first become familiar with BR 135, Fire Performance of External Thermal Insulation for Walls of Multi-Storey Buildings, 3rd edition, 2013?
The 3rd edition probably was after Tony Baker referred it to me, I would think. I had been involved reading the 2nd edition on a scheme previous to this. But the 3rd edition probably was that.
Did you look at the 3rd edition?
I believe I would have done, yeah. I can't recall for sure.
And can we take it that you were, at least from this time, November 2013, familiar with its contents?
Yeah, I think so, because I referred to it before I wrote the BCA guidance note, and this was the forerunner to that.
Yeah.
Just as a way of, understanding the situation a little bit clearer.
Now, this paragraph, which starts, or rather the part of it that starts, the BS 8414 tests do not give a pass-fail answer, went into issue 0 of Technical Guidance Note 18, eventually published in June 2014, verbatim. Take that from me. You can see that it says here, in the penultimate line, that the method needs to be supported by proof that the acceptance criteria of BR 135 have been met. What was the proof with which, or to which you were referring there?
I think what we were getting at with those two sentences is that it has to be a test, and that test has to show compliance with BR 135. So, the acceptance criteria BR 135 could only be met if there was the proof that was provided by the 8414 test.
Indeed, but that's right. But what document did you have in mind that would contain that proof?
Well, at the time, all there was that we knew of was the 8414 test.
So the test data?
Yes, and the graphs therein would tell you whether criteria BR 135 were met.
If you could read them, if you could understand them, interpret them, and apply them?
Yes.
So do we take it from that you were not referring, by the word proof, to the BRE classification reports that would be generated by BRE on the basis of those documents if sought by the manufacturer?
At that time, I didn't know, I don't think any of us knew, that following an 8414 test, a separate BR 135 compliance document was issued.
Thank you.
All we knew of was the 8414 test.
Yeah. Now, then, if we look at the third paragraph from the bottom of this document, I'm sorry, the next paragraph on, actually. It says, however, if no actual fire test data exists, the client may instead submit a desktop study report from a suitable independent UCAS-accredited testing body, BRE, Chiltern Fire or Warrington Fire, stating whether, in their opinion, BR 135 criteria will have been met. The report should be supported by test data the test house already has in its possession, and so this option may not be of benefit if the products have not already been tested in multiple situations / arrangements. The report should specifically reference the tests which they have carried out on the product. Now, this paragraph, and I've read my way through the amendments that Steve Evans made there in track change, was almost word for word published in the first version, issue 0, of Technical Guidance Note 18. What was the source of that third option?
The first meeting with Wintech set the scene that it was potentially an option that other building control bodies, or that Wintech had seen accepted by other building control bodies. We knew that extended application reports of fire tests was carried out and was an accepted way under Appendix A of Approved Document B. We joined the dots up on that one and arrived at this paragraph.
Right. So, just to see if I can understand your evidence on this, the idea of desktops, to use a shorthand, came from Wintech, from what they said at the meetings. We've seen the record of the note of which it said. You then looked at that, looked at extended applications, and drafted what we see here.
Yes. Before that, clarifying that, this was the first time in the context of an external wall assessment that the use of a desktop assessment, it was the first time I'd come across it. we had seen lots of desktop assessments of other things. It was a normal way of doing things.
You refer to extended application, XApp. What were you referring to when you mentioned that a moment ago?
We referred to the Appendix A of the approved document B at the time, and the extended application principles were laid out in those paragraphs.
And was there any discussion that you recall between you and Wintech about the contents of this paragraph, the idea of doing desktop studies at the meeting?
There was... I seem to remember that at the meeting, Wintech, as I've said before, just said they knew of schemes that incorporated combustible insulation that had been proved by virtue of an expert taking a look at it and giving their view that it would have met the requirements.
Did you ask Wintech what it was that experience was based on? Did you ask them, for example, well, which part of approved document B justifies that approach?
We didn't, but we knew that it was there in ADB for extended application.
Where in ADB?
In Appendix A. We knew that the principles of how they should be done was written down there.
Right. So how did this work? Did you go into the meeting familiar with that part of Appendix A to which you've just referred, or did you discuss Appendix A as the justification for this approach at the meeting, or both?
I don't recall specifically, but we knew that Appendix A of approved document B was there that gave the general rules on doing extended application. The fact that Wintech said that they'd seen it carried out by the likes of BRE kind of fitted in with that. We didn't sort of see the need to query why BRE were doing it.
After the meeting, and in the process of producing this draft, which, of course, as we know, accompanied the note of the meeting, did you look again at Appendix A and what you call extended applications?
Yes, because I wouldn't have really wanted to. Well, I did go through it because, otherwise I'd have been making it up off what I thought rather than a researched answer, to write those paragraphs in the guidance note.
So just to get the reasoning clear, you hear at the meeting that desktops are being used, and you hear that from Wintech because they've come across it in their practice, and you then draft this as a proposed approach, having looked again at Appendix A, either again or for the first time, and thinking that Appendix A supported that approach. Have I got that right?
Yes.
Going back to NHB 604, NHB 50604, please. We can just look at that. I'm so sorry. I think 605 is what I wanted, I'm afraid. Sorry, I'm so sorry. NHB 605. You can see that there are three bodies identified in that paragraph, looking at that paragraph: BRE, Chiltern Fire or Warrington Fire. How had you gone about choosing them?
Because the wording in the Appendix A of approved document B referred to suitably, I forget the wording exactly, but it did refer to UCAS accredited bodies. The only ones that we knew of that we'd seen fire tests from were just those three.
Can we then go back, please, to NHB 40604? Perhaps that should be 5 zeros. 604. NHB 40604, I'm so sorry. Here we are. That's right. And if we look, please, at the minute of the note of the minute on page 4, and looking at the third bullet point there. Sorry, under paragraph 3. I'm so sorry, we need paragraph 3 for this. You can see that it says there, as far as can be ascertained, and we've read this before, this is the only test that BRE have undertaken on this product, and so as there is only one set of results, it's difficult to draw any reliable conclusions. Now, this comes at the same time, as we've seen, as the draft. How could reliable conclusions be drawn with one set of test results on K-15, which were available at that time? I think the answer is they couldn't.
Well, it wasn't something that we at NHBC thought about and considered. The rules for carrying out extended application were contained in EN 15725 and the PFPF guide. That said that, paraphrases, says that if there isn't enough evidence to do an extended application assessment, then that shouldn't be done. But the fact that, you know, the likes of BRE and others were doing that and were providing such extended application, we just assumed that they knew the rules around doing them much better than we did, and they wouldn't have provided one if there wasn't the evidence base on which to do one.
Right. Did you go to the BRE at this time, having been told what you were told by Wintech? For example, go back to Tony Baker and say to him, we're looking at desktops as a further alternative route to compliance. Can you please tell us what you've been doing in this context by way of producing extended application reports for external wall build-ups, entire tall building envelopes? Did you do that?
No, we didn't.
Why is that?
I think because at the time it wasn't, you know, happening on one of the jobs that we were seeing particularly at that time. I can't give any real reason we didn't think of it at the time.
But Mr. Lewis, here you are proposing a third option, what became option 3, instead of direct route to compliance, and instead of a full system test under BS 8414, based on an extrapolation from data. Given the importance of what you were trying to achieve here, why did you or anybody else at NHBC not think to go back to the BRE, ask them how and in what circumstances they'd done these before, and what their methodology for doing them was, so that you could be satisfied that you were stipulating for something to your members that was safe?
We didn't think of it at the time.
Are you able to explain why that is?
No, I mean, we were, you know, scrabbling around to try and get something together, to get a guidance note put together that was useful to building control bodies.
Why were you scrabbling around? Surely it was a simple question of saying we shouldn't accept K-15 above 18 metres because it doesn't comply.
That was not something that I could do. I mean, that was, you know, for people above me to, if that was a decision that they wanted to take, that was for them to do. But, you know, there was, as I say, alongside all of this, a BBA certificate.
I'm not quite sure I understand, Mr. Lewis, why you felt it necessary to propose this third way of doing things at all. I mean, all right, you've been told by Wintech that they'd seen some of these studies. I don't know how much detail they told you about them. Was it much?
It wasn't. I mean, we just, as far as I can recall, it was just simply, you know, they were aware that a study or studies had been carried out by BRE on a job somewhere, which had justified its use.
So why are we so keen to include this as a third possible route to compliance?
Because I can't recall specifically, but we were trying to consider all the options. It was, extended application. As I say, we got the idea from Wintech. It did make logical sense that there was that route that could be followed. Granted that the amount of data on which to do that may not have been a great deal, but equally you had to also consider the differences anyway that we were looking at.
But you knew that there was only one test on K-15. At least that was your understanding, wasn't it?
Well, that was at this stage of the game. I don't think we'd even met with Kingspan, so I don't think we even knew that, or what that one test was. I don't think we'd even had a copy of it.
All right, thank you.
At the time, it's right that you were the only qualified fire engineer within NHBC, weren't you?
Well, actually, I've just noticed from the previous email that I wasn't actually awarded the degree until about December time anyway, so technically, I guess in November I hadn't even got a master's degree.
No, but you'd had all the education.
Yes.
And you'd passed your exams.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I was waiting to find that out.
Right. So at this time you weren't even, is this right? Formally at least, the qualified fire engineer in NHBC.
Well, I had the position of the specialist building surveyor, yes, I had that.
Yeah.
I did not, at this point, technically have a master's degree.
Very good. But did you understand that, notwithstanding the formal position, there were others more senior to you in NHBC who were relying on the expertise that you had gathered from the master's course that they had sponsored and you had undertaken?
Yes, I knew that they were looking to me to be, as someone who was a little bit more educated in fire things, maybe, yes, they were looking for my opinion.
Yes. So the decision, or decisions that were made as a matter of policy at and from this point on were made by people above you, of course, but did you understand at the time that they were being made, at least in part, based on, in reliance on what you were telling them or not telling them?
Yes, very much so, yes.
Now, did you discuss the methodology that should be used when completing these desktop studies?
Myself and Steve, I seem to recall, we did discuss it a few times, yes.
What was the methodology?
Sorry, the process listed in the Appendix A of the approved document B.
That's not a, well, we can look at it in this afternoon if you like, but that's not a process, it's a description of an approach, isn't it? My question is a bit more detailed. What were the precise steps in the methodology that the BRE or Warrington or Chiltern that you expected to undertake when extrapolating from test data from one build-up to an untested build-up?
We didn't have that level of knowledge.
No.
We relied upon them to, if they couldn't do it, they should say they can't do it.
And was there any discussion between you and Steve Evans about what the minimum qualifications that somebody needed to have in order to be able to produce these desktop reports?
Well, that was all included in the PFPF guide.
Did you have any discussion about who should be producing these reports?
Well, as I say, at the time we restricted it just to the word in the approved Appendix A talks about the UCAS accredited bodies. We restricted the first version of the guidance note just to the UCAS accredited bodies. And then the Appendix A says, use, follow, recommend guidance is in the PFPF guide. And that was considered to be taking the reasonable steps that the building control body needed to take to ensure compliance.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, is that a convenient moment?
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Millett. Well, Mr. Lewis, we're going to break now so we can all get some lunch. We'll resume, please, at 2:00. And as I said to you earlier, please make sure you don't talk to anyone about your evidence or anything relating to it over the break. All right?
Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'd like to go to the usher, please. Thank you very much. 2 o'clock, please. Yep.